Of course, everything we know about the history of our humanity is wrong. And everything we know about the history of the 19th century, the 1800s, is super wrong. Most of us, all of us, grew up learning about the year 1812 in the history books. We've read about Napoleon Bonaparte, who went to Russia, the ill-fated march to Russia, the burning of Moscow, and the American War of 1812, right? What a coincidence, everything happening in the same year at the same time. In the American War, when the White House was famously set ablaze, right? We are taught that all these were separate, very conventional conflicts of those days that were fought with muskets and swords and cavalry and wooden ships and your typical cannonballs, etc. However, there is lots of evidence now, especially since 17 has been around on the what we call the internet, which is a military tool. And all the evidence suggests that these events were merely a cover story for something much more catastrophic, which was the systematic destruction of the world civilization that we know of today as the Tartarian Empire, or Tartaria, which I don't know if Tartaria is the correct name, but we're going to call it the Tartarian Empire just to have some solid something to speak about. Now, the evidence for this hidden history from the 1800s is not in some hidden museum or basement somewhere, but it hides in plain sight. It shocks you, it impacts your face every day since your birth until your death, and even hanging on the walls of famous museums. In the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg in Russia, there is a painting titled The Great Fire, which depicts the burning of Moscow in 1812. While the art historians, they struggle to explain its details, a closer look reveals something very chilling and, for the big majority of people, very depressing in today's day. The fire depicted on this Great Fire painting does not behave like a typical blaze. The buildings don't collapse in a traditional way, and in the background there is a white light so intense and bright that it mirrors the visual signature of a nuclear explosion. Huge bomb. This light looks less like a flickering flame and more like the thermal devastation seen in footage from the 20th century nuclear tests, the ones that they did after the Second World War. So yes, nuclear super bomb in the 1800s, the same as in the ones in the 20th century. Now, let's speak about the impossible war of 1812, which is not impossible. It's impossible according to our brains because of what we thought. But let's see the reality and the facts. When we look at the numbers, the official story of Napoleon invasion starts to crumble everything because we are told that 600,000 soldiers marched into Russia, but only 10,000 returned. This is often cited as the greatest military disaster in history, blamed on the brutal Russian winter. But the timeline doesn't actually support this. The infamous winter didn't start until November, yet by October, most of Napoleon's army was already gone. Not defeated in a major battle, but simply vanished or destroyed. In just 6 weeks, hundreds of thousands of men were reduced to scattered remnants. Now, what did they actually find when they arrived? French military reports buried in archives, they described the Great Silence, miles upon miles of perfectly intact but completely empty cities. Empty cities. Buildings were undamaged and food was still sitting on tables, but the populations had disappeared as if they had been evacuated in a hurry before something unthinkable occurred. When the fires did start, they weren't the result of slow-moving scorched earth tactics like your typical fire. In Moscow, the fire began on the very day Napoleon entered the city, meaning his forces would have had the time to systematically set the blaze. So they wouldn't, sorry. So his forces, they would not have the time to prepare the blaze and prepare the fire. Now, these were not normal fires. The firestorm in Moscow lasted for 6 days and was so powerful it created its own weather system, like a microclimate, with winds strong enough to lift grown men off the ground. Imagine. Now, most shockingly, eyewitnesses described temperatures so extreme that stone buildings actually melted. Stone buildings do not melt with a conventional fire. Conventional fires, even those in modern buildings, rarely exceed 800 degrees Celsius, but melting stone and turning sand into glass requires temperatures well above 1400 degrees Celsius. So almost double. Let's see the whole thing about the incineration and the burning. If this was just a Russian phenomenon, we might call it a localized mystery in Russia. But in 1812, the entire northern hemisphere seemed to be on fire. At the exact same time Moscow was burning, major cities across America were experiencing accidental catastrophic fires, which are the accidental fires, as they call them, registered in history in the documents in the archives. New York City saw its southern district consumed in a single night. Washington, D.C. was burned so completely that the White House had to be entirely rebuilt. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, Charleston, and New Orleans all suffered massive, huge fires. While historians point out to the War of 1812 as the cause for the American fires and Napoleon for the Russian ones, there is no logical connection between these events in Russia and America, happening on opposite sides of the world and at the same time with the same inexplicable intensity. This pattern extended into Asia and South America as well. In 1812, Delhi, Kolkata, and Manila in the Philippines all reported catastrophic fires. In South America, the city of Caracas, which is now today Venezuela, was destroyed on March 26, 1812. While officially labeled an earthquake, eyewitness accounts from a priest claimed the ground did not shake. It burned. He described heat rising from below and buildings melting instantly rather than falling down. This suggests a coordinated world event rather than a series of unrelated accidents and wars scattered around the world. So a world nuclear war. There's this phenomenon called the Thousand Suns and the radiation sickness, which is recorded in the 1800s. The most haunting evidence comes from the people who are actually there. Multiple eyewitness accounts from Moscow in Russia in 1812 use a specific terrifying phrase. They described a light brighter than 1,000 suns. A light brighter than 1,000 suns. This exact phrasing would not become famous again until 1945, almost 150 years later, when Robert Oppenheimer quoted the Bhagavad Gita after the first nuclear test, which is the same kind of light you would see in a huge explosion of a bomb. One man in Moscow described a great flash in the sky that turned night into day, followed by a sound and then a fire that appeared all at once, as if the air itself were burning. The air itself burning, exactly the effect as when a huge bomb explodes. This sequence, a flash of light followed by a shockwave, is the classic signature of a nuclear detonation. It doesn't have to be, it can be with radiation or without radiation, but it's a huge bomb. Now, in 1812, another soldier recorded seeing trees that were burned black but still standing, with all their branches pointing away from the city center as if pushed by a massive radial wind, the wave. The most conclusive evidence for a nuclear event, huge bomb in the 1800s, is found in a medical report from a Russian doctor treating survivors. The Russian doctor documented symptoms that he could not explain. Patients with deep burns who had never been near a flame, hair falling out in clumps, skin peeling away in sheets, and people vomiting blood and dying within days. Radiation. Even those without visible injuries would fall ill and die weeks later. Today we recognize these as the unmistakable symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. Yet this was being documented in 1812 by a doctor who had no concept of what radiation is. Radiation from nuclear bombs. Now, what are the physical evidence of Tartaria, the scars left after the war? The physical world still bears the marks of this world destruction or world reset. If you look closely at the architecture in Moscow and St. Petersburg in Russia, you can find scorch marks embedded deep within the stone itself. This isn't surface stuff on the rock. It's a mineral discoloration and molecular metamorphosis that only happens when stone is exposed to instantaneous extreme heat, just like the one from a bomb. Archaeologists in Russia have also noted a cultural discontinuity in the early 19th century. There is a layer of ash found under almost every major Russian city at exactly the same depth, marking a moment where civilization, as it was known, simply stopped because of this bombing that happened, the nuclear war. When society began to rebuild, the architecture was different, simpler, smaller, and less advanced. A British engineer working in Russia in 1820 noted that they were essentially rebuilding poorly on the bones of giants, finding magnificent foundations beneath the rubble that were far greater than anything they were capable of constructing at the time. This leads to the question of who these giants were, because it was a different humanity which was taller and bigger than us. The theory points out the fact that the Tartarian Empire was a highly advanced world civilization with unified architecture and sophisticated technology, and of course electricity. They possessed, or they may have possessed, nuclear technology long before the 20th century. Ancient texts like the Mahabharata describe weapons with the power of the universe, the power to destroy. And ancient science like Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan shows evidence of vitrification, which is stone turned to glass, along with radiation levels above the normal background signature. It is possible that 1812 was not the first time, and it was definitely not the first time, that this technology of massive destruction with radiation and bombing was used. But it was, but this was the first time, or this was the time it was used to finally erase Tartaria, or this other humanity empire, from the map of the world. Now, you're going to ask the question, why the cover-up for the last 2 centuries? Well, if a world nuclear war happened in 1812, and you say, why don't we know about it? Yes, we do now. But for the average person, the theory suggests that after the fires died down, after the fires of the war died down and the radiation cooled, the survivors and the forces that initiated the destruction rewrote history. Since the 1800s, they blamed the devastation on Napoleon, on unfortunate accidents, and on natural disasters to hide the fact that a more advanced civilization had been incinerated, destroyed by world nuclear bombs. This reset, in quotes, allowed a new world order to emerge, which is the order that started in the 1800s and was still up until recently, up until President Trump came to power. It was still in effect, that this new world order since the 1800s had forgotten its own history and lost the incredible knowledge of the empire that came before. The evidence for this is not just in the ruins of the world, but also in the sudden loss of building techniques and knowledge after 1812. We as a human species, our human species, we moved from magnificent, complex structures which were not built by us to simpler, inferior replacements. We are told this was just progress, but the physical evidence suggests we are living in the aftermath of a catastrophe we were never supposed to remember. We were not allowed to remember this because all the history was rewritten in the 1800s. When you look at the scorched buildings, the layers of glass in the soil, and the terrifying eyewitnesses documented from the year 1812 and the 1800s, a different picture of our past begins to emerge. It is a picture of a world that was simultaneously attacked and systematically destroyed by bombs and weapons of mass destruction, leaving us with a modern history in the last 2 centuries that is little more than a manufactured lie to cover the tracks of the fallen empire, of the destroyed empire. Understanding the fall of the Tartarian Empire of Tartaria, which I'm not sure if saying Tartaria is correct, or if just saying the previous human empire of white giants, but anyway, understanding this is like walking through an old house where you realize that there's like this basement underneath the house, and you find the door to the basement, and you realize that the entire foundation of the building is very different, and you have all these evidence, especially the whole thing with the radiation in 1,000 suns of 1812, and then the year without a summer in 1816, and that's when you understand that we have lived the past 2 centuries is just a lie, and we live on what was before. We live on the corpse of the old world, but the old world is not ancient. The old world stopped at the beginning of the 1800s. Awesome stuff. See you in the next video.